Okay, I want to talk about misinformation. This leads on from a video I made about content moderation and how difficult it is, and a comment I received in response to that saying, hey, you didn't really talk about misinformation and I wished you had. What I will do, the comment was by Samsonoff. I'll show you it on screen. You don't have to read the comment for this video to make sense if you're just listening, as I often do. Okay, you can just listen, but if you want to read the whole comment, it's there. It's a very good comment. It's a very moderate and reasonable and well thought out comment, and I said that I would respond to it and give my thoughts because I think this whole misinformation thing is big enough to warrant a video on its own. You might not agree with what I say. I'm interested to know what you all think. I know it's as contentious as any of these other subjects, and I know they'll get wildly different responses. First, just let me say that one of the things that Samsonoff talked about, the main thrust was that there's obviously forms of misinformation that are against the interests of society. People are expressing views that are just flat out wrong, that are against the interests of society, and that we ought to be promoting what is for the good of society. Samsonoff kicks that off with talking about schools. Remember all the debates about teaching the controversy regarding evolution versus creationism. Moderating curriculum and setting test standards for all children is about controlling which information is propagated through society. Not all opinions in that context matter. Okay, so interestingly, just to address that bit directly, my son goes to a faith school. It's kind of difficult not to in his age group because the Church of England and the Catholic Church control more than 50% of state-funded schools in the UK. So, yeah, it kind of limits your choice if you're not prepared for that. And he will be told things which are misinformation, right, which are just wrong. But not in a science classroom. This is the issue. It's not the fact of whether these things are taught in school. It's the specific standards we have with regard to a science classroom. So the question then becomes, do we want to see Twitter and YouTube and Facebook function as if they are a school science classroom? And I would suggest the answer is a flat out and resounding no. Even within a school, we don't want all the subjects to function like that. We have religious education classes where we might talk about creationism. My wife used to teach sort of morality and ethics, talk about euthanasia and abortion and racism and things like that. And she would get the children themselves, the pupils, to come up with the arguments on each side of the discussion. So even within a school setting, that sort of hardline approach is not always appropriate. It certainly isn't what I want on Twitter. I want to give my thoughts more generally on this. First, let me say that I think that there's a kind of, it's an odd situation that we have with misinformation on social media, in that it's sort of portrayed as if sort of Donald Trump invented it a few years back. I can only really think back. I'm 50. I can maybe only comment on the last 35 years. But within those 35 years, there is no point in my life where I wasn't well aware of misinformation. It is very high up in the arsenal of the tools that politicians use, that those who are interested and political advocates use, those who are interested in socio-political perspectives and have agendas with regard to that they want to bring forward, use, that journalists use. Misinformation is a stock in trade for these people and has been for a very long time. And it's kind of bizarre that it's treated as if it's this new fear, this new thing that we've got to be really scared of, and we need to deal with it now. Otherwise, some untold terrible thing, the far right will just take over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, if we don't deal with this. I don't see that. I see this as something that has been happening for a long time. What I do also see right now is a kind of, it's almost like the same situation that we have in sport, where we get very, very concerned about cheating, don't we? But only certain forms of cheating. If you're taking performance-enhancing drugs, then we start having a fainting couch moment. But you could do something such as in football, soccer. You can dive in the penalty area. Nobody's touched you. You dive, you roll round and round as if your leg's just been hacked from under you, like you're never going to walk again. If you get away with that piece of cheating and you get a penalty, you almost certainly get an entire goal. which is a very big thing to have in a game of football when a lot of games are won 1-0, 2-1. Okay, there's a very, very large chance of it having a tangible material effect on the result. Whereas if you take a bit of EPO, if you're micro-dosing to try and slightly increase your aerobic capacity by 1 or 2%, it probably won't have any impact whatsoever. And yet everybody would get very po-faced about that. And yet the type of cheating that has a huge effect, the commentators and everybody else laughing it off as just part and parcel of the game and something that we've always had. There is no consistency here in how we deal with cheating, and there is no consistency in the way that it scales with the impact that it has, and I think that's the same thing with misinformation. There are some kinds of misinformation that we just shrug our shoulders to. It's almost as if we don't see them. We have become so habituated to their existence, and then other forms that, like I say, it's totally over the top, the response that we have to them, in my view. And yet, is it not perhaps the case that some of these forms that people are most concerned about are the most blatant forms? They are the forms that most readily ring the alarm bells in anybody other than those who really just want to believe it, right? And so you could say whatever you like. They're just looking for something that flatters their pre-existing beliefs, and that you could Google and check out within a matter of 30 seconds or a minute, whereas some of these less blatant forms of misinformation that politicians have been so wont to use over the years, they are actually the more insidious ones. They're the ones that have been harder to deal with and have affected our politics in society after society after society for decades now, probably for all time. We see it in all sorts of things. We see in the way that people manipulate statistics, the way that people cherry pick pieces of information when they know that the examples that they are giving are not typical examples. They're doing these things to mislead and to misinform. We all know that, and yet we allow it. And yet what we're talking about here is often things, very specific things, which all of a sudden we can't allow these kinds of things because they're wrong. And it's going to be terrible if we allow them. Whereas some of these things are the easiest things to call out. They only require you to post a link or a single piece of information. They don't require you to post a thread of 10 tweets to pick apart exactly the game that is being played. So the claim really is that the problem with this misinformation is that people are expressing views and giving information that is against the interest of society. Okay, and so really what we ought to be doing, just as in the school classroom there, controlling the information that is propagated through society. Okay, propagation of truth as best we can rationally figure it out matters. That's what Samsonov was advocating for, is that we adopt a similar position here. There are a lot of problems with that. I've highlighted one of them already, in that it's really open-ended, because then all these things that we've been allowing for decades we're not going to allow. Effectively, we're not going to allow normal political discourse, because normal political discourse, regrettably, is built upon misinformation, misdirection, trying to mislead people. The other problem is that there's no agreed metric. And I mean, fundamentally, there really is no agreed metric. Maybe one of the most significant axes on that would be collectivism versus individualism. Jonathan Haidt, in one of his books, gives a bit of quite a beautiful exposition of this, of how he grew up in Western societies that were individualistic, and he just assumed that was his only mentality. So he viewed the good of society in terms of individual rights and freedoms. When the individual can flourish and their individual freedoms and expressions can flourish, then that is the good of society. And then he went to live in more collectivist societies. I think India was one of them for several years, and it gave him a totally different perspective. It's not that it necessarily changed his personal perspective, but he saw that other perspectives could be in many ways equally valid. A collectivist perspective, whereas the good of the individual can reasonably be suppressed if it is for the benefit of society as a whole, right? The society is a collection of individuals. And of course you see this perhaps in more extreme forms in certain societies, China, somewhere like that, where it's deemed quite acceptable to really suppress what people can do, what people can say, because it's for the good of China, it's for the good of society as a whole, even if for the individual it is to their detriment. So these are very, very different ways of looking at it. Also, when we're talking about misinformation, we're talking about what is true or false. We need to be empathetic to the fact that a lot of what people say that is false, they believe to be true. So where do we end that? If somebody makes a claim that's based on a religious belief, and they earnestly believe that that thing is true, but from our perspective, it's misinformation, then do we censure that? Do we say, well, that's something you can't propose anymore? To say that abortion is wrong because God says so, it's wrong because God doesn't exist, right? It doesn't take a genius to work that one out, so that's an argument you can't make anymore. I don't think there are many people that would want to do that, right? We don't really want to go down that line. It's certainly the line the religious have gone down in the past with regard to those that don't believe in God. Try to make the same thing, because what do they say? Well, obviously it's true that the God that we believe in exists, and this is the problem. You have to have some kind of panel, just like the school science board, right, that you'd have in America. It's a national thing in the United Kingdom, a national curriculum. But you've got some kind of panel, some kind of board that decides what the sort of accepted narrative is going to be. Do we really want that with regard to these things on our social media platforms? That seems to go against what I want those social media platforms to be. I want those social media platforms to be platforms where we can bring all these different things together. We know the free marketplace of ideas doesn't work in as much as the best ideas always float to the top, but we've worked under that model for a long time now, since before I was born. And if your better ideas, those ideas that you regard as better, don't rise to the top, what you're supposed to do is to advocate them for them more vociferously, try and make better arguments, promulgate your arguments more widely, maybe advocate for them a little bit better, not stamp an iron fist on the desk and declare that you are objectively right and everybody else is objectively wrong. Let me give you another comment that was left on this thread, just to show you how quickly that descends. This was by another poster, Ramble Sophistry, who I'm sure believes what they're saying and believes that they're talking about the things that they believe are objectively true, but it really sounds rather sinister. They don't want to see fascism online, and yet their comments sound more fascistic than the things that they're talking about. Redefining terms isn't the issue. It is objectively clear that the right wing is doing hard fascist with their rejection of human rights and the damage their ideology is doing to human beings in areas they control. The position I am taking is objectively verifiable and so is not subject to subjectivity. When their interlocutor said, "You just proved my point," they said, "Yeah, no. There are objective tools we can use to determine what is and isn't acceptable in the marketplace of ideas." Note we're drifting now, mission drift, from what is accurate information effectively to what is acceptable. They are not subject to language definitions, but to logic and scientific and rational definitions. We're talking about human rights, and this is logic and scientific and rational definitions that are objectively true. My point stands regardless of your opinion on it. This is the kind of thing that people like me are scared of, right? People who will say, once you start putting these standards down, well, this one's beyond contention, that when somebody says this thing, it causes harm, ergo, it cannot be allowed because it might not factually be correct. They don't believe it's factually incorrect. Of course, the person who's saying it thinks it is. That's why they're saying it. It's really not as straightforward as they would have us believe. And let's be honest, if we're talking about what's good for society, then it is what is absolutely true is that there are true statements. We can all think of some which might not be good for society. They are true. They're not misinformation, but they probably would be better if we didn't know them or if we didn't say them. There are also some things which are probably wrong, or almost certainly wrong, objectively wrong, but it might be good for society if we did say them and if everybody believed them. That is what some proponents of certain forms of religion say. Well, it might not be technically true, but society would be better if everybody believed it. And maybe that is so. I blanch at the idea that we go down a line, therefore, where what is good for society dictates what we can say and what we can't. And that I start mandating what you have to believe is true. You can't say this thing that you believe in your heart is true because I've determined for all time now that it's not true, right? And so that opinion can't be expressed. It can't come back on the table to have a chance to rise to the top, whilst at the same time allowing politicians, political advocates, social advocates, journalists to continue with the same devious manipulative tripe that they have carried out for decade after decade, just because they're a little bit more sophisticated at it, just because it takes a few more minutes to pick apart, that they can carry on doing it, even though most of the time they're doing it well aware that what they are providing is misinformation. In my view, the answer to misinformation, to address Samsonov, is counter-narrative. I had no objection whatsoever with YouTube and Facebook when certain subjects were brought up, putting a little piece under saying, look, have a look here, right? This will give you some information. You can go and read that information. It gives you... Maybe you won't believe it because of the source, but it shows you that there's another side to maybe the video that you're about to see, maybe the information that you're about to read. And so if you are honestly interested in examining what is true and what is not, it gives you a starting point there, doesn't it? If you don't want to do that, well, then you're probably not going to do it anyway, right, is what I would say. Yes, you are being misinformed, but with your own consent. You are wanting to be misinformed. There are plenty of people out there that want that, I think. So misinformation or not, that's not going to change where they are at fundamentally. Okay, interested to know. This is going to get some good responses, this video. I know it is, because it's a... I know I'm going to get some responses from Americans because I know in some ways they have been hit harder with specific instances of misinformation that they seemingly haven't managed to counter within their society particularly well. And so we get this argument that sort of hard right are always going to win, which obviously isn't the case, right? The United Kingdom isn't hard right. I don't think it's ever been hard right in my lifetime, despite people espousing hard right views. And when the BNP's Nick Griffin got to espouse his views on Question Time a number of years back, something which people said would be the terrible thing because then his misinformation everybody would get to hear it and we'd all be hoodwinked by it. It was the death of his party. The very opposite. When his information was allowed out there, but alongside other information, it wilted. It floundered. It was shown up for the rubbish, the nonsense that it was. I think that's a better way to handle it than banning arguments, that's saying, like a school science classroom, no, we've decided the right from wrong. We're deciding what's allowed. We're deciding what classes as information and what classes as misinformation. And if you disagree with that, well, it's too late, really. The decision's made now. That's it. The committee has decided on your behalf what information you are allowed to hear to make your mind up for yourself. Everybody can surely see the danger with that. I just quoted from you somebody else who posted that just sort of highlights exactly where people run with that kind of mentality. Okay, like I said, interested to hear what your thoughts are on this. Thank you for listening if you've got this far. Bye for now.